Lots then to talk to our guest about. Ben Barry, former Director of British Army Staff, UK Ministry of Defence. Hello to you. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. We saw that absolute tragedy over the weekend when an apartment block with 2,000 people inside was targeted by the Russians. What more do we know?
Well, I think we know that most of them actually got out, but sadly there's been some casualties. I mean, this is all part of Russia's campaign to attack Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, power, heating, and the railways. Some of the cruise missiles they're firing are pretty accurate, but at the moment they seem to be firing a lot of less accurate ballistic missiles and obsolete naval cruise missiles. So it isn't surprising, I'm afraid.
Can attacks like this be described as war crimes?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. If they are actually aimed at a military target and they've gone off course, that's probably not a war crime. But if they've actually been deliberately aimed at the Ukrainian civil population, for example, if they were deliberately aimed at that apartment block, there would be a case to answer for a war crime.
Talk to me more generally then, if you would, please, sir, about Vladimir Putin saying his special military operation, I'm quoting him directly, is developing within the framework of the plan. Does that mean the tide is changing in this war?
Well, the tide's changed several times. It changed in spring when the Russians failed to attack Kiev and withdrew from it, turning their main effort to the Donbass. It's changed again with the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive at Kharkiv, and more recently with the counteroffensive at Kherson. It seems at the moment that Russia just doesn't have the offensive combat power on the ground to be able to recapture substantive territory, hence much of the front lines turning into attrition, rather like a First World War battlefield.
You talked about how he's changed his top commander on the ground several times, done that again over the last week or so. Every time that happens, we seem to see even bloodier, more deadly attacks. Do you think that is each of them trying to prove that they are more successful at trying to win this war than the previous one?
Well, that may well be the case, Kay. Of course, the previous commander remains in the chain of command, but General Gerasimov, who's the overall Russian forces chief, has now taken charge of the whole operation. Whether, though, he can think of any new strategic gambits that will unlock the battlefield, that's a difficult question to answer, because, of course, the war began badly with considerable over-optimism displayed by Russia and a high level of strategic and military incompetence. Whether he can make the Russian forces much more competent, I should say, is an open question, I think.
Who's winning this war at the moment?
Well, yes, they still seem to have a difficulty properly coordinating combined arms, for example. Even with the addition of the Wagner private military company, they're finding it very difficult to concentrate sufficient force at a decisive point to break through. Whereas on the other hand, Ukraine's fighting a strong defensive battle and continuing to use its US-supplied HIMARS rocket launchers and other Western weapons, as well as its special forces and partisans, to attack Russian positions throughout their depth. So the chances of a Russian breakthrough in the near future, I think, are pretty low.
Including the promise of 14 Challenger 2 tanks from the British government. Going to hear more on that from the Defence Secretary in the House of Commons later on today. We're speaking to the Lord Dannett last week. He says that's nowhere near enough. What do you think?
Well, Ukraine's been very clear. It said it wants a minimum of 300 modern Western tanks, 14 British tanks and about a dozen Polish tanks that Poland has in principle said it's delivered, is only a small proportion of that. That's 2 companies of tanks at most, whereas what Poland's asking for is about 6 battalions worth of tanks. Now, there are a lot of modern Western tanks in Europe. There's 2,000 odd Leopard 2 tanks, which is the sort that Poland's supplying. And it ought to be not too difficult for European NATO nations that have Leopard 2 to club together to find about 400 Leopard tanks.
There's an issue, though, isn't there, with these Leopard tanks? Perhaps you could explain that to us. It's a German licence, and so there's a sticking point.
Yes, they're German built, and under the terms in which they were sold to the countries concerned, Germany has a veto on them being sold to a third party. Now, Germany, of course, is a nation that has a degree of institutional pacifism built into its constitution. And in the past, it's refused to supply weapons to an active theatre of war. Although Chancellor Scholz, shortly after the war began, in his speech saying Germany was at a Zeitenwende, a turning point, implied that Germany would become much more assertive in exporting weapons to Ukraine. They have, of course, exported weapons from anti-tank weapons to the recent declaration of about a battalion's worth of Marder infantry fighting vehicles. But there still seems to be a degree of political and institutional reluctance in Germany. But we will see shortly there's to be a NATO nations summit of the contact group with Ukraine, including all the nations beyond NATO. And that's to coordinate arms and equipment supplies and deliveries to Ukraine. And it may be that Poland and the UK have both acted in a way to encourage Germany to remove the restrictions on the exports of Leopard 2 tanks.
Sure. But to that end, Christine Lambrecht, I think I'm right in saying the Defence Minister is basically on her last legs when it comes to her political position. And there's a lot of criticism internally for her lack of action. What sort of challenges do you think that political disharmony in Germany, what sort of challenges do you think that could play out in the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, if Germany makes difficulties about this approach to sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine will have less combat power than it would like. We need to be clear that the reason Ukraine said it wants 300 tanks and 600 or 700 infantry fighting vehicles, as well as another 500 additional howitzers, is so it can build up heavy armored or mechanized formations to mount a strategic counteroffensive this year to evict Russia from Ukraine. If no one supplies more than the current 25 odd modern Western tanks that the British and the Poles have declared, Ukraine's going to find that a lot more difficult.
Okay, good to talk to you. Thanks for explaining that to us this morning. Thank you.
That's all.